Today, I am proud to create him Prince of Wales.
The room did not erupt when King Charles delivered the announcement. It became unnaturally still. Camilla's expression froze. William lowered his eyes, and every advisor understood that the balance of royal power had just shifted. With one carefully prepared declaration, Charles placed his eldest son at the center of the monarchy's daily command, and left his wife facing a future she had never believed would arrive so suddenly. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles knew everyone inside Buckingham Palace had been summoned without explanation. Camilla sat rigid beside him. William remained silent across the table. Catherine watched her husband's hands, and Princess Anne studied the advisors who had arrived without briefing papers. The king's health, workload, and the monarchy's stability had created a problem he could no longer delay. Someone had to control the daily machinery of the crown, the senior household decisions, strategic planning, public priorities, and coordination between royal offices, and that person could no longer be Charles alone. The king placed both hands on the table and announced that William would assume immediate operational authority. No one dared challenge him after that. Operational authority meant practical control over how the royal household functioned each day, although the sovereign would remain on the throne. The prince did not look triumphant. He looked burdened. Catherine saw hesitation cross his face and placed her hand beside his, to steady him without speaking. Anne noticed the gesture, then turned toward Camilla as the queen consort gripped the arm of her chair. Camilla asked whether the arrangement was temporary. Charles answered without softening the words. The transfer began immediately, and his eldest son would act with the monarch's full approval. She stared at him as though the answer had erased an agreement. William lifted his eyes, but he offered no reassurance. The future king understood that accepting power beside his father felt less like advancement than trespass. A senior advisor carried forward a sealed red folder. The red folder, a traditional case used for important government and royal papers, was placed before William. Inside lay signed instructions bearing Charles's approval, proving the transition had been prepared before Camilla entered the room. Anne watched her expression change and understood the deeper truth. This announcement had not only elevated the heir, it had destroyed the belief that closeness to the king guaranteed control. But as Camilla stared at the folder now resting before William, the true wound was becoming clear. This was not only about the future of the crown, it was about everything each of them believed they were still entitled to protect. Behind the formal announcement stood three people confronting three very different fears. Charles was surrendering control before he felt ready. William was inheriting responsibility without the protection of distance. Camilla was watching influence disappear in front of her. The monarchy called it continuity, but inside the family it felt more personal. A father measuring his strength, a son suppressing his doubt, and a wife realizing loyalty could not guarantee power. Charles had spent most of his life preparing for the throne, enduring years of waiting, while imagining the kind of reign he would one day lead. Now the king had finally reached that position, only to discover that duty was demanding something cruel from him, surrendering part of his control before he felt his work was finished. William understood the pain beneath his father's calm expression. As heir, the person next in line to inherit the crown, he knew every decision he made would be judged as either support for the monarch or a silent criticism of him. Camilla felt the exclusion like a personal wound. She had believed Charles would discuss any transfer of authority with her before presenting it to the family. Yet Catherine's measured silence and Princess Anne's complete lack of surprise told her otherwise. The queen consort looked from one woman to the other and realized they had known enough to prepare themselves. Her shock hardened into humiliation. Loyalty had carried her through scandal, rejection, and years of public hostility, but loyalty had not secured the influence she believed would remain beside the king. William found Catherine moments later and admitted in a private conversation that accepting the authority felt like stepping into his father's place while Charles was still standing there. The prince feared that decisive leadership would look like impatience, yet hesitation could make him appear weak. Catherine listened without interrupting, then told him not to confuse responsibility with betrayal. She reminded her husband that the king had chosen him because he trusted his judgment, not because he wanted to be pushed aside. William heard the reassurance, but the burden remained. Charles watched his son return to the room and recognized the guarded expression William had worn during earlier family crises. The monarch had not selected him because he hungered for power. He had selected him because the future king repeatedly restrained himself when ambition would have been easier. That self-control offered stability, but it also made the transfer more painful for both men. Camilla later summoned one of her closest aides and asked, during a private exchange, how long the arrangements had been under discussion. The aide hesitated before admitting preparations had begun weeks earlier. That pause told her more than the answer. Anne had known. Catherine had been prepared. Charles had made his choice, while his wife remained outside the circle. Camilla's attention settled on Princess Anne, whose composure now felt less like discipline and more like evidence. The suspicion formed quickly and refused to fade. Anne had not merely supported the decision, she may have forced the king to confront it. That suspicion would soon lead everyone back to the private incident that transformed quiet concern into an irreversible royal ultimatum. The decision had not begun with a legal document or a public crisis. It began during a private dinner at Windsor Castle, when a routine discussion turned into the moment Charles could never forget. One question was asked, one instruction was challenged, and one silence exposed the danger of divided authority. Those present would later remember that evening as the point when William's rise stopped being a distant possibility and became an urgent necessity. Charles had resisted changing the palace structure for months. Conflicting instructions were already moving between his office, Camilla's household, and William's team, leaving senior advisors uncertain about whose decision carried final weight. The king understood why that confusion mattered. One wrong order could exhaust him, embarrass the family, or create the impression that he was no longer controlling his own reign. Yet restructuring the system felt equally dangerous because it could encourage public speculation about succession, the formal process through which the crown eventually passes to the next monarch. Camilla raised the issue during dinner after learning that William had overturned a major Commonwealth engagement schedule. The Commonwealth program, a planned series of duties involving nations connected through the historic association led by the monarch, had originally placed Charles at the center of several demanding appearances. The queen consort turned toward him and argued that the heir should not countermand instructions approved through the king's household. William remained calm, but his reply carried unmistakable force. The prince said the schedule had placed his father under unnecessary strain and had been approved without properly considering his condition. Camilla's frustration sharpened. She accused him of presenting concern as duty, while quietly using it as a path toward control. William answered that protecting Charles was not ambition, and the future king refused to apologize for stopping a plan that could have harmed him. The exchange grew personal, because both believed they were defending the same man, yet neither trusted the other's motives. Charles set down his glass and ordered them to stop. Silence followed. Then the monarch requested the briefing papers that had authorized the original schedule. No one could produce a clear answer. One instruction carried approval from Camilla's office, another referred to William's team, and a third appeared to come from advisors acting in the king's name. That confusion struck Charles harder than the argument. The crown's center of command had become impossible to identify. Anne waited until dinner ended, before asking to speak with her brother alone. During that private conversation, the Princess Royal warned him that divided authority would eventually produce a public disaster. She told Charles that refusing to choose who controlled daily operations was not neutrality. It was a decision to let confusion rule. Charles spent the night reading competing memoranda, which were formal written records of advice and decisions. Near dawn, the king reached the final page, took up his pen, and circled William's name. He knew what the choice would save. He also knew what it would cost. And when Camilla finally confronted him over that hidden decision, years of loyalty, resentment, and unspoken fear collided behind a closed door. Camilla did not wait for advisors to explain what Charles had done. She followed him into a private sitting room, closed the door herself, and demanded to know why his wife had been treated like an outsider. Charles did not raise his voice. That made the confrontation more devastating. Every answer arrived quietly, forcing Camilla to hear what she had feared most. The decision was deliberate, final, and rooted in doubts he had never spoken aloud. Charles entered the room already exhausted, yet the king knew fatigue would not protect him from what was coming. Camilla's anger had been sharpened by one unbearable fact. Catherine and Anne had been consulted while she had been left uninformed. Their marriage had survived scandal, public hostility, and decades of scrutiny, so the queen consort had come to believe that private loyalty guaranteed a permanent place in royal decision-making. To her, this was not merely exclusion. It felt like betrayal. Camilla asked whether he still trusted her. Charles answered that affection was not the issue. Constitutional clarity, the need for one unmistakable line of authority inside the monarchy, had become essential, because competing instructions were weakening the household. The monarch told her that marriage could not be allowed to blur command. She heard the explanation, but what she felt was separation. The man still loved her, yet the crown no longer trusted her influence. Camilla pushed a chair away from the table and accused William of waiting for the chance to replace them both. Charles finally hardened. He said the prince had repeatedly avoided demanding authority, even when others urged him to take a stronger role. That restraint, the king insisted, was precisely why his son had earned the responsibility. William's reluctance was not weakness. It was proof that he understood the cost of power. Camilla's anger broke. She asked whether everything she had endured to stand beside him now counted for nothing. Charles looked at her, and admitted that her sacrifice mattered deeply to him. But the monarch also said the crown could not be managed as repayment for personal suffering. Love could honor what she had survived. Duty could not reward it with unchecked control. Charles then disclosed, during that private confrontation, that he had personally authorized Anne to review the transfer plan. The Princess Royal had examined the structure because she understood palace discipline and would not soften her judgment for anyone. He also confirmed that Catherine would support William in shaping the new royal program, meaning the Princess of Wales would help guide priorities, duties, and the monarchy's public direction. Camilla stood in silence as the final pieces connected. The decision had not emerged from one frightened night. It had been strengthened by an alliance she had never seen forming. When she opened the door, Anne was waiting in the corridor. The queen consort met her eyes, and neither woman spoke. Nothing needed to be said, because behind Charles's announcement stood a quieter alliance, one built not on affection, but on discipline, duty, and a ruthless understanding of how power must survive. William's elevation may have carried Charles's signature, but it survived because three people were prepared to enforce it. Anne brought institutional discipline. Catherine gave William emotional steadiness and public credibility. Charles supplied the authority only a reigning monarch could grant. Together, they created a structure Camilla could neither delay nor reinterpret. Yet beneath that unity lay a painful truth. The king had built the mechanism of his own retreat. Charles still wore the crown and remained the sovereign, meaning the reigning monarch who held the highest constitutional position. William, however, now controlled the monarchy's daily strategic direction. The prince would shape priorities, settle disputes between royal offices, and decide which duties demanded immediate attention. That division mattered because it preserved the king's position while removing the confusion that had weakened his household. It also meant every major decision would now reveal whether the family truly accepted the transfer. Anne understood that danger better than anyone. The Princess Royal had no claim to William's future authority, and no need to compete for public attention, which made her the one person Charles trusted to guard continuity. She met her nephew alone in a palace office, and placed a handwritten list before him. William read the names slowly. They belonged to people he loved, respected, or feared disappointing. Anne told him that authority would not be measured by how well he directed obedient staff. It would be measured by whether he could refuse those closest to him. William admitted that he feared humiliating his father by appearing too decisive. The future king knew that every quick order could be interpreted as proof that Charles had become unnecessary. Anne refused to comfort him. She warned that hesitation would cause deeper damage, because it would make the transfer appear both urgent and useless. The king had taken a painful risk. His son now had to prove that risk had meaning. Catherine later spoke privately with Charles, and promised that her husband would never treat the transition as a victory. The Princess of Wales said William understood the difference between receiving responsibility and celebrating another man's weakness. Charles was moved by her restraint, yet the reassurance cut deeply. The monarch realized she was protecting his dignity because everyone could see how vulnerable he had become. The signed framework made that vulnerability impossible to disguise. The framework, a formal set of written rules governing the transfer, stated that separate royal households could not reverse William's decisions without direct written approval from Charles. That single condition closed the informal channels Camilla had once used to reshape plans through private access to the king. The first test arrived almost immediately. William reviewed a high-profile arrangement approved by the Queen Consort's office and cancelled it without delay. Advisors froze, waiting to see whether Charles would intervene. He did not. Within hours, names were removed, instructions were rewritten, and Camilla received the first unmistakable proof that William's authority existed not on paper, but in action. Power revealed itself through small changes before anyone dared call it a revolution. Telephone calls were redirected. Briefings were sent to a different office. Decisions once carried automatically under Camilla's name returned marked for William's approval. There was no public announcement of her diminished influence, yet every corrected schedule delivered the same private message. The palace had begun listening for another voice, and Camilla could feel the silence forming around her. William's office moved quickly. The prince now controlled major scheduling, household coordination, long-term patronage planning, and the allocation of senior royal duties. Patronage planning meant deciding which charities and public causes each royal would formally support, a role that shaped both reputation and influence. Staff members also received a new instruction. Whenever two royal offices issued conflicting orders, the matter had to be referred directly to William's team. The confusion exposed at Windsor could no longer be allowed to return. Camilla received the revised state reception plan before midday. She read the page once, then again, searching for the changes she had personally requested. They were gone. The Queen Consort set the document down and asked her private secretary whether the removals had come directly from the heir's office. Her aide hesitated, then confirmed that William had reviewed the plan himself and rejected the alterations. Camilla kept her voice steady, but the humiliation was impossible to hide. She had once shaped arrangements through a quiet word, a private call, or direct access to Charles. Now she needed approval inside a structure she had previously influenced without resistance. The loss was not ceremonial. It was practical, immediate, and deeply personal. William learned of her reaction through a confidential briefing from his senior aide. The future king felt no satisfaction. He briefly considered restoring one request as a gesture of peace, hoping it might show that authority did not require cruelty. Catherine stopped him before guilt became policy. She told her husband that reversing his first major decision would not look compassionate. It would make the entire transfer appear uncertain and invite every displaced voice to challenge him again. Charles faced the same test when Camilla appealed to him privately. The king listened as she explained that William's rejection had reduced her to a spectator within her own household. He did not dismiss her pain, but he refused to intervene. The monarch said he could not grant his son authority in public and then secretly weaken it in private. Doing so would recreate the exact disorder that had forced the transition. Camilla understood the message. Charles would comfort her as a husband, but he would not rescue her as king. That boundary left only one path forward. She requested a private meeting with William, without Catherine, Anne, Charles, or any advisor present. With the palace now divided by loyalty and wounded pride, William agreed to meet Camilla alone, and the future of their relationship rested on a conversation without witnesses. There were no folders on the table when William entered. No aides stood behind the chairs. No monarch waited to settle the argument. Camilla had asked for a private conversation, and William had agreed because neither of them could continue hiding behind procedure. What followed was not the confrontation the palace expected. It was something more dangerous, an honest exchange between two people who had spent years interpreting each other through old wounds. William entered believing she would demand that he reverse the decisions already made. The prince expected pressure, accusation, perhaps even a warning, that Charles would eventually regret empowering him. Camilla understood that open resistance would isolate her further, yet the queen consort refused to disappear without explaining what the transition had taken from her. This mattered because the struggle was no longer only about schedules or influence. It had become a question of whether she still had a meaningful place beside the king. Camilla spoke first. She told William that she did not fear his competence and had never doubted his ability to lead. What frightened her was becoming irrelevant to Charles at the exact moment he needed support most. The queen consort said she had spent years learning how to steady him during pressure, anger, and uncertainty, only to find that her closeness was now being treated like a threat. William listened before answering. He told her that his new authority was not designed to remove her from his father's life. The future king recognized that Charles still needed her emotionally, but he could not allow personal access to become an alternative chain of command. A chain of command meant the clear order through which decisions passed from the person in authority to those expected to carry them out. Without that clarity, the palace would fall back into the same confusion that had forced the transfer. Camilla's voice softened. She admitted during that private conversation that she had sometimes defended her influence because she remembered how long she had lived without legitimacy. For years, the queen consort had been questioned, rejected, and treated as though her place could vanish overnight. William finally understood that her need for control had grown partly from insecurity, not only ambition. The prince did not excuse the damage, but he recognized the wound beneath it. William then offered her a defined role centered on supporting Charles and continuing selected public duties. He made one boundary unmistakable: strategic authority would remain with him. Camilla accepted the arrangement without asking him to weaken it. That choice changed the room. She had not won, yet neither had she been erased. Camilla left calmly, carrying neither triumph nor visible defeat. William remained behind, aware that the silence between them had finally become something close to understanding. That fragile settlement gave Charles and his son the unity they needed for what came next. By the time the palace gates opened the next morning, a private family settlement had become a public royal earthquake, and the nation was ready to judge what it meant. By sunrise, the announcement had escaped the palace walls and become the only story Britain wanted to discuss. Television studios abandoned their schedules. Crowds gathered beside royal gates. Commentators searched every sentence for signs of abdication, illness, or family fracture. Yet one image dominated the morning: William stepping forward beside Charles, not replacing his father, but visibly carrying a burden the king had finally chosen to share. Palace officials released a carefully worded statement confirming the prince's expanded authority, while stressing that Charles remained king and would continue his constitutional duties. Those duties were the formal responsibilities carried out by the sovereign, including approving state business and representing national continuity. The wording mattered, because one careless phrase could suggest abdication, while too little detail would make the transfer appear secretive. Broadcasters quickly called it the most significant internal shift of the reign, dividing opinion between those who saw weakness and those who saw foresight. London woke to a front page that captured the shock in 5 words: "The King hands William the reins." Beneath the headline, Charles stood half a step behind his son. The photograph spread faster than the official explanation, because it told the public what palace language could not. The monarch still held the crown, yet the future king had moved unmistakably forward. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace, as supporters raised their phones and watched the royal standard above the building. The royal standard was the flag flown when the sovereign was present at a royal residence. One woman, speaking during a live television interview, called the decision "a father trusting the future before it is too late." Her words traveled across broadcasts because they stripped away protocol and reduced the moment to its emotional truth. Camilla watched the coverage privately beside Charles. Commentators described the queen consort as the transition's greatest loser, suggesting that influence had shifted from the king's wife to his heir. She switched off the television before the discussion ended. The monarch looked toward her, but she did not ask him to challenge the narrative. Their private settlement with William had taught her that public dignity now depended on refusing another battle. William answered the speculation through his first formal statement. The prince praised his father's service, promised to carry the responsibility with humility, and explicitly acknowledged Camilla's support for Charles. His words were deliberate. The future king intended to consolidate authority without turning her humiliation into public theater. The queen consort heard the statement and understood the gesture for what it was. Not restoration, but respect within a boundary neither would cross again. The public gradually accepted the structure. Charles had not abandoned the throne, and William had not seized it. The monarchy had survived by admitting that continuity sometimes demanded surrender before crisis made the choice impossible. And when the cameras moved away, the family was left with the only verdict that mattered: what had been lost, what had been preserved, and who they had become through the transfer of power. In the end, there was no coronation, no abdication, and no triumphant victor. There was only a family forced to accept that power could no longer remain where habit had placed it. Charles kept the crown, but released his grip on its daily machinery. William gained authority, but lost the protection of waiting. Camilla surrendered influence, yet preserved something more human: her place beside the man, rather than above the institution. Charles remained sovereign, the reigning monarch who still carried the crown's highest constitutional authority. William now directed the monarchy's central operational future, controlling strategy, household coordination, and the decisions that shaped its next chapter. Camilla continued supporting the king personally and publicly, but she no longer possessed a separate line of command. The arrangement mattered because competing instructions had threatened stability, confused advisors, and weakened confidence. One clear source of operational leadership had finally replaced the uncertainty. Charles asked his son to meet him privately after the public storm had begun to settle. The king admitted during that closed conversation that handing over responsibility had been the hardest act of his reign. He had waited most of his life to lead, only to discover that true leadership demanded surrender before pride felt ready. William answered that accepting the authority had been the hardest act of his own life. The prince had gained power, but he had also lost the safety of standing behind his father. Camilla entered after William departed. She did not ask what the two men had discussed, and the queen consort did not demand reassurance about the influence she had lost. She simply sat beside Charles. The monarch reached for her hand, offering an answer more personal than any official statement. Their marriage remained intact, but the constitutional boundary, the clear separation between private closeness and royal command, would remain equally firm. William's rise was no palace coup. It was Charles's final expression of paternal trust. The king protected the monarchy by choosing his successor's strength before illness, confusion, or crisis could make that choice for him. The future king accepted without celebration because he understood that his advancement had come through his father's painful retreat. Camilla emerged wounded, but not destroyed. William stood empowered, but not victorious. Charles appeared diminished in daily control, yet enlarged by the courage to place duty above pride. Each had lost something, but the crown had gained the clarity it needed to survive. This moment marked the emotional end of one royal era and the disciplined beginning of another. Charles proved that kingship was not only the ability to hold power, it was the wisdom to release it at the exact moment its transfer could preserve everything larger than himself. From that day forward, Charles remained the king, Camilla remained his companion, and William became the monarchy's commanding future, not through conquest, but through a father's painful, deliberate, and final act of trust. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.